Welcome to Royal Education. My name is Mr. O, and today I'm going to be doing a series called Talk EDU. So I'm going to put the name of this talk right here and explain what the purpose of this talk is. So in these talks, I'm going to be focusing a lot about the common questions that college counseling students have. So a lot of times there's a lot of mysteries and different things that students don't understand about the college process, particularly in the United States. And today I'm going to be addressing a lot of the common questions that students have in order to help you guys understand what, sort of the process is like and what sort of stuff do you need to be aware of in order to make it easier for you all to sort of transition into the college process. And so I'm going to be addressing a lot of the common questions that I originally got through Reddit. Students asked some questions here and there, and so I thought, why not make a video based on it? And so before I go ahead and do so, here are my general credentials that, about my background, what I do, and so on. Be aware that when I'm doing these discussions and I'm talking about, different perspectives, some of it is really grounded in facts. Just from my personal experience being a college counselor for many years, along with my personal experience going through the college process and graduate school process, along with the fact that some of it is going to be a bit opinionated, so don't believe 100% things as, you take it sort of with a grain of salt sort of thing. But this is what I personally believe. And that being stated, I also want to make it clear that this does not automatically, state that automatically you don't need a college counselor, that these things will 100% address everything. There's a lot of little nuances that exist in the college application process. And whenever you need like sort of professional help and so on, we do also provide that at Royal Education. But that being stated, we're going to go ahead and get started. So today, I'm going to be talking specifically about a common theme that came up around recommendation letters. And I'm going to go ahead and write that. So what is recommendation letters? So usually in the college process, dependent on the school that you are applying to, some schools require what is called recommendation letters, which are letters that are written on your behalf from other people. Usually it's from teachers, your college counselor at your school, but along the times there's also questions around whether or not the significance around outside recommendation letters and, the topic that covers around this, around that concept or what you need to know about these recommendation letters. So the first question, the common question, and that I will be covering today, is the importance of recommendation letters. Versus, your grades, exams, etc. So that's a common question that's discussed, so I'll be covering that topic today. The second question that was posed commonly that I've seen is around are outside recommendation letters useful or required? And I'll be talking about that particularly for today also. The third question that people have mentioned is around how do you choose your recommenders? Choosing recommenders. How do we go about choosing which ones are good, which ones are not? Sort of just common things, themes that you have to think about when you're choosing recommenders and so on. The fourth question that was posed was about are recommendation letters recommendation letters required for all schools? And then the very last question that was posed, and usually in these videos I'll be trying to cover at least like 5 questions just to make it very significant, content worthy and so on for your time. So how importance of your counselor's recommendation letter. And in this particular topic, I'll also cover about what happens what if I don't personally know my counselor. And so these are going to be the 5 main questions today I'm going to cover about. So first question, once again, importance of these recommendation letters versus your personal grades and your SAT, ACT scores, so on. The second question, are outside recommendation letters, important? Third thing, about choosing recommenders. Fourth, about are recommendations required for all schools? And fifth, the importance of your counselor's recommendation letters. And what if you don't personally know your recommender? Okay? And so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first question, being that importance of recommendation letters versus the importance of recommendation, versus grades. Okay? So when we talk about the importance of recommendation versus grades, I do want to make it very clear to students, to other people, that recommendation letters, for the most part, and this is not 100% the case, but for the most part, will not suddenly dictate whether or not you'll get into a school or will not get into a school. And so if, let's say, you have grades in your class, and so let's say for one semester, you have, particularly in one semester, the scenario is that you have a bunch of A's, but what happens is that you get a really bad grade here, and so on, okay? And so in a scenario when you get grades sort of like an A's and C's and a B and so on, a lot of times this will impact your chances of getting into a school. No matter how amazing your recommendation letters are from, your teachers or your counselor and so on, usually the case is that grades do trump recommendation letters for the most part. The reason why is that usually it's a very tangent sort of case where, your recommendation letters will bolster your identity and who you are and so on. But colleges do want to see whether or not you are strong enough as a person to handle academics, to handle teachers, different type of teachers, to handle different styles of teachers, or even at times teachers that are very strict or hard graders. And so a lot of times the indication of getting C's will hurt your chances, particularly for the upper tier universities. We're talking about schools like UCLA, like the Ivy Leagues, like the top tier liberal arts schools, like Amherst, and so on. And so whenever it is a case that you get grades like C's and so on, it is recommended that one, you do talk to the counselor, especially if there is the case that you have a really, really strict teacher. Let's say the teacher, bombed everyone, gave everyone C's and so on, that the college counselor or the counselor at your school does write or mention this in their letter, that teacher in particular does not grade very fairly or doesn't grade very nicely, and thus why you have that type of grade. If you don't have that type of excuse for the C's, a lot of times this will hurt your chances, and the part is that it is more important first and foremost to really get your grades down and your scores down, because those are things that in the relative sense that you could control for yourself. And so I wouldn't say that the recommendation letters will make or break your application automatically and decide things, but it is important to still sustain your grades, to sustain certain things, and making sure that you do well, and that you ensure that your image as a student is sustained during the process. So this is my answer for the very first question. Continue on to this very second question. The second question that was posed to me is the question, what the significance around outside recommendation letters? And when I'm saying outside recommendation letters, these are not recommendation letters from your teacher. These are not recommendation letters from, your counselor and so on. These are recommendation letters that come from either an organization head, either from like a volunteer you do, or a music instructor that you had, or even a professor or individual that you took through like a community college, state university, and so on. And so are they required? No, they are not required. And many times there are a good number of students that do get into, these top tier universities without outside recommendation letters. But are they useful? I would say for the relative part, yes. The important thing when you do outside recommendation letters is that you make sure that the recommender actually really knows you very well on a personal basis. What I mean by that is that that person knows you as who you are as a person, not just a random student or a random intern or a random volunteer that exists around the area. That they actually know your story, your motivations, and who you are. And that will really help a lot with the recommendation letter, since a lot of times outside recommendation letters tend to lend itself to be very personal. Tends to be the extra letter that's not required at all from universities. It gives you an opportunity to show a different side of yourself and allow admissions officers to get to know you better. And so when particularly we do recommendation letters, I do want to emphasize a very key point about recommendation letters. That is do not overdo it. So what I mean by that is that if the usual requirement is like you 2 or 3 recommendation letters from your teachers and from your counselor, but on top of that, usually I recommend only sending 1, if at most 2 outside recommendation letters. If you send the admissions office like 5, 6 different ones, which I have actually heard in the past of students doing, you will actually hurt the chances of you getting into the university, because overdoing it will only put more paperwork on the admissions officer, and sometimes they don't like that, especially if these outside recommendation letters are not very personal or very extra and don't really add to the dimensionality of you as an individual. And so just be careful to not overdo this sort of thing, and make sure that if you ask an outside recommender, that person really will put in something very unique about you that your teachers or your counselor did not have a chance to mention about you. And so that will be the main thing about this second question. So continuing on to the third part. So for the third part, the question that we mentioned is, how do you choose your recommenders? Choosing And so when I'm talking about choosing recommenders, I'm talking about the very significance around when you're choosing, especially your teacher recommendation letters, who do you choose? For the first part, always choose teacher recommenders that know you very personally or know you well about your intellectual capacity. Could talk a lot about your performance in the class that you did really well in. That will really sell you and make you a really strong candidate for any university or school that you apply to. When it comes to choosing recommenders, this is really reliant on your identity and who you are, and along with the fact of what you are applying to. So for example, let's say that you are applying as a physics major to a university. In this particular case, it might help you a lot if you have a strong recommendation letter from your physics teacher and from your math teacher, because those 2 particular topics are very important and will lend itself to strengthening your profile. The same goes for any other topic that you are interested in. And so really this is really dependent on individual basis. But that being stated, there was a very interesting thing, especially that came up around the Harvard, lawsuit that's going on with Asian Americans. And I'm not going to go into depth about per se the court case or my stance on it, because that's not the purpose of today's video. More about what did they mention during the court cases or procedures. They said that a lot of the reasons why a good number of Asian Americans or potential candidates for the school do not get into schools like Harvard or these top schools is because they have weak recommendation letters. And so this really lends itself to this sort of unfair situation for some students, particularly because you most likely will not have the chance to ever see what your teacher writes about you in these recommendation letters. Thus, it helps to do a little bit of research, to talk to other people outside, sort of get to know how do they do in their college application process, or find out whether or not that individual will actually write you a good recommendation letter. This is something that might take you some time, but make sure that especially you choose a teacher that is reliable and that will make sure to put in a good word for you. And so, take your time and make sure, to choose the person that will for certain represent you and it will help your application for the colleges. So that'll be my answer for number 3. So continuing on to number 4. So number 4 is, are recommendation letters required required for all schools? The straight answer for this is no, it is not required for all schools. But for especially the upper tier universities, they do require it. So if you're looking at the Ivy Leagues, if you're looking at schools like Amherst, Williams College, these like Pomona, etc. Yes, they do require at least 2 recommendation letters. That is the minimum requirement from the teachers, along with a required recommendation letter from your counselor. But that being stated, not all schools are requiring it. So like school UC system does not at the most part require it at all. And so there are some benefits to that, because some students personally don't, have hard time securing recommendation letters. Sometimes maybe their teachers, they weren't at school as much, or, different scenarios lend itself to the reasoning that, hey, I really can't get a recommendation letter. And so you could plan accordingly. There are a good number of other schools outside of the UC system. A lot of state schools don't require recommendation letters. A lot of other smaller, liberal arts schools and here and there don't require it. And so, you could plan accordingly and make sure that you could still apply to a bunch of universities without having to worry about that. That's the situation. And to continue on to the very last question for today. The last question that was posed was about the importance of the, counselor's recommendation letter. Importance of counselor's recommendation letter. Rec letter. Along with whether or not you need to know them personally. Personally know. And I'm paraphrasing this a little bit. No counselor. Okay. So when it comes to the importance of counselor's recommendation letters, for the most part, they're significant to a degree. And I'm not going to say as in that it's a make or break scenario or anything like that, but definitely you need to make sure that your counselor knows what to write down in the recommendation letters. A significant thing is that if the counselor doesn't do a good job writing the information needed, so breaking down like the demographics of the school, the average SAT scores, different little factors like that, or it's just really badly made recommendation letter, it could at times actually hurt your chances of getting into, universities. But that being stated, how important is it for you to know your counselor personally? It varies, but for the most part, I haven't seen it being a really significant change factor. But if it doesn't hurt for you to know your counselor, so that means potentially at times if it's during lunch or during different times of the day, or even just going to their office once in a while to meet them, to update them how you're doing, to get advice from them, will actually help your recommendation letter. Why? Because in the end, if the counselor knows you better and knows your motivations and knows who you are as an individual, it only makes the recommendation letter more personal at the very end of the day. And so I do highly recommend still getting to know your counselor. At times, in schools, they're called college counselors. Some schools don't have that. They just have normal counselors. And so dependent on your school, make sure you find out who that person is, because they'll be the one sending that information along with adding anything that you particularly need to add in case of different scenarios occur that, the person or like your grade is the issue, or if there's other scenarios at school that you feel that your counselor could divulge that your teachers can't. That will help you a lot on your recommendation letter and making sure that you have this controlled around, recommendation letters and so on. That being stated, this is the main thing I'll be talking about today. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any other questions, it doesn't matter if it's also about other questions about recommendation letters that I did not cover, or if it's other things about colleges and different things like that, feel free to leave a comment below. Please do subscribe to our page. Definitely do subscribe, because I'm going to continue to make videos like this in the future. So please do, support us, as I'm going to continue to make videos and try to, help support high school students, whether you're in the US or international. I'll be doing my best to help you out understand the process for the US schools, and, hope you have a wonderful day.